All right, good evening, everyone. I have returned. We're going to be going through yet another chapter of Days of Rage. This time it's chapter 3. You say you want a revolution, the movement and the emergence of Weatherman. He's a real weatherman, ripping up the motherland, making all his weather plans for everyone. Knows just what he's fighting for, victory for people's war. Trashes, bombs, kills pigs, and more. The Weatherman. Weatherman song to the tune of the Beatles' Nowhere Man. Pig America, beware. There's an army growing right in your guts, and it's going to bring you down. Weatherman editorial, December 1969. Weatherman, or the Weather Underground Organization, as it was eventually known, was the first and by far the largest group of people to launch a nationwide campaign of underground violence on American soil. A faction of the leading 60s era protest group, Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, it boasted a membership that stood in sharp contrast to those of later underground groups, whose members tended to be fringe militants. Weatherman was composed of the cream of the protest movement, including some of its most visible activists. They may have been the country's first Ivy League revolutionaries. Much has been written about Weatherman, especially its above-ground origins and its early months in 1969, which were marked by all manner of bizarre behavior, not least its members' penchant for engaging in sexual orgies. Much less has been written about Weatherman's actual underground operations, which have remained cloaked in secrecy for more than 4 decades. Partly as a result, Weatherman's multi-year bombing campaign has been misunderstood in fundamental ways. To cite just one canard, for much of its life, Weatherman's attacks were the work not of 100 or more underground radicals, as was widely assumed, but a core group of barely a dozen people. Almost all its bombs, in fact, were built by the same capable young man, its bomb guru. Nor, contrary to myth, did Weatherman's leaders, especially its best-known alumni, Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, operate from grinding poverty or ghetto anonymity. For much of their time underground, Dorn and Ayers lived in a cozy California beach bungalow, while the group's East Coast leaders lived in a comfortable vacation rental in New York's Catskill Mountains. Of far greater significance is widespread confusion over what Weatherman set out to do. Its alumni have crafted an image of the group as benign urban guerrillas who never intended to hurt a soul, their only goal to damage symbols of American power, empty courthouses and university buildings, a Pentagon bathroom, the U.S. Capitol. This is what Weatherman eventually became. But it began as something else, something murderous, and was obliged to soften its tactics only after they proved unsustainable. To begin to understand all this, one needs to understand the protest movements of the 60s, and to understand that turmoil, one must at least glance at the decade that produced all those young, angry activists, the 1950s. For much of white America, the 50s was a time of suffocating conformity, when parents born during the Depression and empowered by winning a good war taught their children that America represented everything that was right and true in the world. These were the happy days when a booming economy sent wealth soaring and children, born by the millions, grew up in homes where every family seemed to have 2 cars in the driveway, a stereo cabinet, and in 50 million homes by 1960, a television. How happy were Americans? When a 1957 Gallup poll asked people whether they were very happy, fairly happy, or not too happy, an astounding 96% answered very or fairly happy. The employers will love this generation, University of California President Clark Kerr, said in 1959. They're not going to press many grievances. They are going to be easy to handle. There aren't going to be riots. And then, as if overnight, things changed. More than anything else, it was the pictures of young Americans began seeing on those new televisions in 1960 of stoic Southern blacks dragged away from all white lunch counters, of black protesters being beaten bloody by red-faced Southern deputies. That laid the groundwork for the white protest movement. The violence and injustice was shameful enough, but it was what those pictures said about America, about what an entire generation of young people had been taught, that felt like a betrayal. America wasn't a land of equality. It wasn't a land of the good and the just and the righteous. It was all a lie. Those were feelings, at least, that consumed many of the idealistic white students who joined the civil rights movement after those first sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. There were only a trickle at first, but when pictures of Southern thugs beating the first Freedom Riders in 1961 were broadcast, the numbers grew. A host of white groups sprang up to work within SNCC in those first years, but by far the most influential was SDS, at the time an obscure youth branch of an even more obscure socialist education organization called the League for Industrial Democracy, which traced its origins to 1905. SDS's emergence was spearheaded by a freedom rider named Tom Hayden, a one-time University of Michigan student who served as SDS's president in 1962 and 1963. It was Hayden who, at a conference of barely 60 SDSers and allies on the coast of Lake Huron, drafted the protest manifesto that became known as the Port Huron Statement. Grandly billed as an agenda for the generation, the 50-page document by itself did not electrify or even mobilize campus activists across the country. But it did establish an agenda for SDS, broadly anti-war, anti-poverty, and pro-civil rights, that over time would attract hundreds and then thousands of mostly white students across the nation. That the massive baby boom generation would produce a politically liberal or even radical voice had long been anticipated. The sociologist C. Wright Mills had actually written an open letter to the New Left in 1960, asking what was taking so long. SDS and its intellectual allies, wanting to distance themselves from the communist Old Left that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had destroyed, took the New Left mantle as their own. SDS thus became the core of the 60s New Left, much as the New Left became the core of the broader protest movement. The movement, in quotes. The movement, capital M movement, grew all through 1963 and 1964, propelled both by social shocks, such as the assassination of President Kennedy, and of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi, and by the first whiffs of true campus unrest, especially in the emergence of the free speech movement at the University of California in Berkeley. Much of white activism was still drawn to the struggle for Southern civil rights, at least until 1966, when Stokely Carmichael's call for black power served as a warning that white protesters were no longer wanted, much less needed. It was then, when the white protest movement badly needed something new to protest, that the new war in Vietnam, accelerating in 1965, caught its attention. SDS crouched unsteadily at the center of the gathering storm. Somewhat like a social fraternity, it existed as a string of campus chapters linked by a national office that attempted, through conventions, newsletters, and traveling emissaries, to direct the individual chapters, with mixed degrees of success. In practice, the chapters largely went their own way. But the highest echelon of SDS, its national leadership, did tend to draw the liveliest minds in the movement, and their utterances were widely followed. All through 1965 and 1966, SDS members peopled myriad civil rights and anti-war demonstrations, hundreds of them, But a kind of malaise soon set in. Every month brought more and larger protests. Yet there seemed to be little improvement in black civil rights, and more American soldiers poured into Southeast Asia every day. Clearly, if the SDS and the broader movement were to bring about the fundamental changes they so badly wanted, a new set of tactics would be needed. The first stirrings of something greater than mere protest, something momentous, could be heard in SDS leadership circles by the end of 1966. The first to voice them was the organization's national secretary that season, Greg Calvert, a 29-year-old history teacher from Iowa State who would be gone from SDS by the time others began going underground. It was Calvert who, in the face of widespread frustration at the speed of change, first began using Malcolm's word, revolution, to characterize the level of struggle the movement needed to bring to America. In a report to membership in November 1966, he wrote, "Let's quit playing games and stop the self-indulgent pretense of confusion. I am finally convinced that a truly revolutionary movement must be built out of the deepest revolutionary demands and out of the strongest revolutionary hopes. The demand for and the hope of freedom." This was still a long way from planning actual violence, but an intellectual foundation was being laid. Calvert's call struck a chord, as did the slogan he coined that swept the movement that winter of 1966 through 67. From protest to resistance. At least initially, no one was entirely sure what resistance meant. But out on college campuses, students quickly provided the answers. All through the first half of 1967, protesters who once silently carried signs began confronting authority. When a district attorney tried to confiscate copies of a student literary magazine at Cornell, a crowd of angry students sold it in brazen defiance. When 6 were arrested, others surrounded the police car and freed them. At Penn State, student protesters occupied the president's office until he provided information about the university's practice of releasing student organization lists to Congress. That's interesting. So these people were basically getting doxxed, or the equivalent of the 1960s equivalent of getting doxxed, I guess. But it was SDS itself that propelled by far the largest resistance movement to the military draft. The first draft resistance groups began springing up in early 1967 and were soon widespread. Many students openly burning their draft cards or wearing a popular SDS button, "Not with my life, you don't." This kind of open defiance to government authority, along with disclosures of US bombing of North Vietnamese civilians, drew tens of thousands of young people into the movement even as its intellectual leaders, especially in SDS, began musing about ever more militant ways to confront the government. Protests alone, they could see, were no longer enough. As an SDSer named Dotson Rader put it, it's a strange name, Dotson Rader. It's almost like a book character or something. Sounds like a made-up name. Dotson Rader. Private Eye. The meaninglessness of nonviolent democratic methods was becoming clear to us in the spring of 1967. The civil rights movement was dead. Pacifism was dead. Some leftists, the Trotskyites, Maoists, radical socialists, some of the radicals in SDS, Stokely Carmichael, Rap Brown, Tom Hayden, knew it early. But it took the rest of us a while to give up the sweet life of the democratic left for revolt. One of the most striking characteristics of radical thought during the late 1960s was the flash-fire speed with which it evolved. An idea could be introduced, accepted, popularized, and taken to the next level in a matter of months, sometimes weeks. And so it was with the path of resistance. No sooner had the broader movement plunged into the realities of draft and other resistance that the keenest thinkers began pondering what came next. Defying the government was giving way to confronting the government. And there was only one place to go intellectually once the government was confronted. It was Greg Calvert once more who first put it into words, at least publicly, in a front-page article in the New York Times in May 1967. The article, which attempted to take stock of student resistance activities, suggested that violence was the movement's logical next step, a contention it supported with a quote that Calvert quickly recanted. "We are working to build a guerrilla force in an urban environment." No other student leader seconded it, and because it suggested a tactic few in SDS had even considered, much less approved, it was broadly renounced. But not by everyone. The intellectual cat was now out of the bag, and as the movement exploded into public consciousness during 1967's Summer of Love, the first voices could be heard saying that Greg Calvert was onto something. After years of talk and restlessness, 1968 changed everything. It was as if the earth itself was exploding in protest. Suddenly, as if in concert, students and working people around the world, in France, Germany, Great Britain, Mexico, Northern Ireland, Finland, Brazil, even in China, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, rose up and demanded that their governments change. Every night on the evening news, it was as if the same roll of film were being broadcast over and over from country to country. Thousands of young people holding protest signs, students leaping over barricades, steel-helmeted police and soldiers staring impassively or, increasingly, beating them down. For those in power, it felt as if the world was crumbling around them. For those in the streets, it was as if the entire world was aflame. Suddenly there was a single word on everyone's lips: revolution! The revolution. A single, global uprising of the oppressed was happening, right now, all over the world, and would soon come to America. It was an idea that seemed to wash over the movement in a matter of minutes. Easy to discuss, harder to grasp, harder still to actually believe. Yet it spread with stunning swiftness. In the summer of 1968, barely a year after Greg Calvert had been pilloried for suggesting that protesters became urban guerrillas, a study found that more than 350,000 young Americans considered themselves revolutionaries. The term, of course, meant many things to many people. For most, unwilling or unable to accept the far-fetched notion that a violent uprising might topple the government, the word revolution became a kind of shorthand for fundamental change. When they used it, they meant a revolution in American norms, in the power structure, in civil rights, in attitudes toward the poor and dispossessed. No sane person, it was widely assumed, believed the US government could actually be overthrown. But others did believe it. For the hardcore, for those who saw governments teetering everywhere, who felt that the movement was doomed to failure, who despaired at the murders of change agents such as Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, 1968 bore signs of the apocalypse. For these activists, who might be called apocalyptic revolutionaries, there was a vivid and growing sense that the world was on the brink of historical, irreversible change, and that the morally corrupt American government, murdering the Vietnamese, unleashing dogs on Southern blacks, and beating its protesters, was poised for imminent collapse. SDS's leadership happened to be populated by an outsized number of Jewish students, and for many of these, the notion of challenging a US government they imagined as the second coming of Nazi Germany had enormous appeal. All that was needed was a push. Castro had done it in Cuba, Lenin in Russia, Mao in China. Why not in America. This was a powerful idea, at once outlandish and intoxicating, providing a rush of intellectual adrenaline as strong as any drug. It was also, as Kirkpatrick Sale notes in his definitive history, SDS, The Rise and Development of the Students for a Democratic Society, the inevitable result of everything that had happened to that point in the 1960s. Revolution. How had it come to that? It was a blend of many things: bitterness, hatred, and alienation, hope, confidence, and conviction, energy, passion, and need. It was the pattern woven by all the threads of the 60s, the inevitable product of the awakened generation as it probed deeper and deeper into the character of its nation. There was a primary sense, begun by no more than a reading of the morning papers, and developed through the new perspectives and new analyses available to the movement now, that the evils in America were the evils of America, inextricably a part of a total system. Clearly, something drastic would be necessary to eradicate those evils and alter that system. Various reforms had been tried. Confrontation had been tried. There had been civil rights agitation, university pressures, anti-war marches, doorbell ringing, electoral action, student power, draft resistance demonstrations, campus uprisings, even tentative political violence, all to little avail. Worse, those who wanted peaceable change, who tried to work through approved channels, seemed to be systematically ignored, ostracized, or, as with the Kennedys and King, eliminated. More was necessary, and in the words of one SDS leader, what it came to that year was that people came to the conclusion that the only way to stop the war was to make a revolution, and the only way to stop racism was make a revolution. The monster, that was the recurrent phrase now, could not be altered, deviated, halted. It had to be destroyed. All right, let's stop here for a second and reflect. So it's very funny. This terminology that gets invented for the current powers that be. So these people have a current or a congruent term with the cathedral, basically. They call it the monster, essentially, which is very strange because we've heard it called the cathedral, we've heard it called the octopus, we've heard it called a lot of words, basically. All of these same terms mean the same things, right? They all mean the regime, ultimately. So that's very interesting that they have their own term for the system as such. And of course, it always takes this idea of monster or octopus or cathedral or some kind of architectural or mythological figure. Let's continue on. Apocalyptic revolutionaries represented a strident new voice in the movement, but they were able to draw from a wellspring of ideas that weren't entirely new. Philosophies, arguments, books, and films that had sprung up around armed resistance movements worldwide. They studied Lenin and Mao and Ho Chi Minh. It went without saying that revolutionaries were almost always communists, but their favorite blueprint was the Cuban Revolution. Their icon, Ernesto Che Guevara, Castro's swashbuckling right-hand man. A handsome doctor, Che represented the thoughtful, caring revolutionary who resorted to violence only to fight an unjust government, By 1968, his poster could be found hanging in dormitories across America. The apocalyptic revolutionaries' favorite movie was The Battle of Algiers, a 1966 film that portrayed heroic Algerian guerrillas doing battle against their French occupiers. In time, once people actually began going underground, their Bible would become Mini Manual of the Urban Guerrilla, written in 1968 by a Brazilian Marxist named Carlos Marighella. It outlined dozens of strategies and tactics, analyzing weapons, outlining ways to organize a guerrilla cell, even describing the best ways to rob a bank. A number of underground newspapers would excerpt Marighella's manual. We actually believed there was going to be a revolution, remembers Weatherman Paul Bradley. It says here, Paul Bradley is a pseudonym for a long-serving member of the Weather Underground. And of course, I have written in the margins of my book here. This is funny how it's a very waspy-sounding name. Paul Bradley. Paul Bradley. Continuing on. We believed the world was undergoing a massive transformation. We believed third world countries would rise up and cause crises that would bring down the industrialized West. And we believed it was going to happen tomorrow, or maybe the day after tomorrow, like 1976. We really thought that it would happen. I know I did. For the moment, it was all just talk, and crazy talk at that. But by early 1968, apocalyptic revolutionaries, kamikazes one SDS report called them, were rising to the fore in every SDS chapter, prophesying the coming conflict. They always seemed to be the loudest, the angriest, the most voluble, and they refused to be shouted down. Chapter after chapter was split between armchair protesters and action factions who wanted action, often violent action, right this second. The spark could have happened anywhere. In the event, it happened at Columbia University in New York, where in April 1968, the SDS chapter's action faction grew outraged at the segregation of a proposed gymnasium and the university's ties to a Pentagon-sponsored think tank. After a peaceful protest, a group of SDSers occupied Hamilton Hall, Columbia's administration building, and refused to leave until the gym was scrapped and ties to the think tank were severed. When an administrator named Henry S. Coleman went to meet them, he was taken hostage and barricaded into his office. Police surrounded the building, but declined to storm it, worrying about inflaming adjoining black neighborhoods. A kind of siege ensued, with the occupying students using bullhorns to harangue crowds of the curious. Had all this happened in San Diego, it might have been dismissed as a random instance of especially aggressive protesters. But because it happened in New York, the world's media center, Columbia became an overnight phenomenon as images of angry, shouting students were beamed to television sets across the world. As far as the press was concerned, the star of the show was the student spokesman, a soft, husky New Jersey sophomore named Mark Rudd, whose dramatic poses, typically one fist raised, the other wrapped around a bullhorn, appeared seemingly everywhere, climaxing with the cover of Newsweek. For mainstream America, Rudd became a dismaying symbol not only of SDS, but of the movement itself. The prototypical nice Jewish boy from the suburbs transformed into something new and angry by these strange times. Lol. Yeah, it's very interesting that all of this stuff seems to kick off at Columbia of all places. If I remember correctly, um, I want to say that Herbert Marcuse was teaching at Columbia in the 50s and early 60s, if I'm not mistaken. If not him, it's one of the other um, postmodernist types. It's very strange. And I think he was one of the few who actually really truly fled Europe during the Nazi period and managed to find himself in a major university institution. So it's very fascinating how that works. And of course, basically 20 years after he arrives at this university, oh, look, now there's a student radical faction that's making trouble. Wow. Interesting how that works. Interesting how clockwork these things are. Behind the scenes, however, the driving force behind the occupation, and the man who would eventually craft the philosophical framework for Weathermen, was Rudd's best friend, a hyper-intense, motor-mouthed Connecticut leftist named John Jacobs, universally known as JJ. Brilliant and handsome, with a streetwise style marked by beat-up leather jackets and slicked-back hair, JJ was already a legend at Columbia when the protests began. Some thought him a prophet, some a poseur. But either way, he was surely the purest voice of the apocalyptic revolutionary. Where mainstream commentators viewed Columbia as a student protest, JJ told anyone who would listen that it was far, far more. The first step toward a genuine American revolution. Concrete evidence that young people working together could bring the country's white elite to their knees. More than anything else in the SDS universe, it was JJ who popularized the parallels between Colombia and the Cuban Revolution, who preached that a select group of hardcore rebels could, as Castro and Guevara had with Cuba, lead America into revolution. At first, everyone thought JJ was crazy, remembers his friend Howie Machtinger. But then events kind of caught up with him, and suddenly what he was saying seemed almost sensible. As outlandish as that idea might sound today, it emerged as a popular argument among the apocalyptic radicals in 1968, and would endure as the rationalization behind almost every underground group of the 1970s. Known as the FOCO theory, it had been advanced in a 1967 book, Revolution in the Revolution, by a French philosophy professor named Régis Debray. A friend of Guevara's who had taught in Havana, Debray argued that small, fast-moving guerrilla groups, such as those Che commanded, could inspire a grassroots rebellion, even in the United States. Debray's theory, in turn, drew on what leftists call vanguardism, the notion that the most politically advanced members of any proletariat could draw the working class into revolution. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these ideas were catnip to budding revolutionaries like JJ, many of whom had no problem imagining themselves as American Ches. Their ardor was undiminished by their heroes' inability to make the FOCO theory work in Bolivia, where soldiers had captured and executed Guevara in 1967. Veterans of the Colombia occupation, which ended with police storming the occupied buildings and arresting many of the protesters, would eventually constitute the largest single group of Weathermen. In Columbia's aftermath, both JJ and Mark Rudd emerged as stars in the SDS firmament. While Rudd embarked on months of fundraising trips, JJ fatefully fell in with another up-and-comer, a strikingly attractive 26-year-old law student named Bernardine Dorn. Dorn was destined to become the glamorous leading lady of the American underground. Unquestionably brilliant, cool, focused, militant, and highly sexual. J. Edgar Hoover would dub her La Pasionaria of the lunatic left. For those who are unaware, La Pasionaria is a reference to the Spanish Civil War. Was a Republican, well, I should say more properly, communist dictator or not dictator, broadcaster on the Republican side, who was very famous for her extremely passionate radio addresses and appeals to the international community for help for the Republican cause. So that's what J. Edgar Hoover's referencing here. A high school cheerleader in her Wisconsin hometown, she graduated from the University of Chicago in 1963 and, while working toward her law degree, began assisting a host of protest groups, including SDS. Clad in a tight miniskirt and knee-high Italian boots, Dorn burst onto the scene at Columbia, where she helped arrange bail bonds. Everyone who met her, every man at least, seemed mesmerized. Every guy I knew at Columbia, every single one, wanted to fuck her, remembers one SDSer. And Dorn knew it. She liked to wear a button with the slogan, "Cunnilingus is cool, fellatio is fun." She and JJ were immediately smitten with each other. Bernardine would be arguing political points at the table with blouse open to the navel, sort of leering at JJ, an SDSer named Steve Tapas recalled. I couldn't concentrate on the arguments. Finally, I said, "Bernardine, would you please button your blouse?" She just pulled out one of her breasts and in that cold way of hers said, "You like this tit? Take it." Another SDSer, Jim Mellon, recalled, she used sex to explore and cement political alliances. Sex for her was a form of ideological activity. Yet even many SDS women soon idolized Dorn. Everyone wanted to be in her favor, to be like her, a weatherman named Susan Stern said years later. She possessed a splendor all her own, like a queen, a high priestess, a mythological silhouette. In the summer of 1968, buoyed by her sudden popularity, Dorn mounted an out-of-left-field bid to become SDS's inter-organizational secretary, one of 3 co-equal leadership positions, and, to widespread surprise, won election at the National Convention that June. More than a few found her too beautiful to take seriously. When one questioner asked whether she was in fact a socialist, Dorn took a moment, looked the man square in the eyes, and memorably replied, "I consider myself a revolutionary communist." Together, Dorn and JJ became a force of nature in the SDS universe. Years later, friends would term their loud bouts of sex animal mating. From the beginning, they had their eyes on seizing overall control of SDS. They were stars, and that summer they took their newfound fame and ambitions to Chicago, which was the site not only of SDS's national headquarters, but of that August's Democratic National Convention, which drew thousands of protesters into pitched battles with Chicago police. Their apartment, near downtown, became the epicenter of SDS politics, especially for those who shared JJ's apocalyptic views. Many of the brightest SDSers, including several who would achieve prominence in Weathermen, swung by that autumn to crash, drop acid, and ogle Dorn as they listened to JJ's rambling, amphetamine-fueled soliloquies on Che and DeBry and every other revolutionary topic imaginable. One was Jeff Jones, a handsome Southern California kid who looked, and some thought acted, like a dim-witted blonde surfer. Another was Howie Machtinger, a scrappy University of Chicago PhD candidate. An SDS contingent from Ann Arbor, Michigan, was especially significant. It was led by Jim Mellon, a 35-year-old activist. His protege, Bill Ayers, a lippy, hedonistic rich kid whose father was chairman of Chicago's Commonwealth Edison. Ayers' girlfriend, Diana Oughton, and their close friend Terry Robbins, a wiry, intense SDS ambassador at Kent State. As this group coalesced around J.J. and Dorn in the winter of 1968 through 1969, political violence was spreading on campuses across the country, much of it fueled by the Vietnam War's escalation and the new Nixon administration's vow to crack down on student protesters. By one count, incidents of bombings and arson, mostly Molotov cocktails thrown in the night, had increased to 41 that fall, a 300% rise from the spring. ROTC facilities burned in Delaware, Texas, Berkeley, and Oregon, and at Washington University in St. Louis, where a SDSer was convicted of arson. Campus buildings were bombed at Georgetown, the University of Michigan, New York University, and 4 California colleges. When the ROTC building at the University of Washington burned, students danced by the light of the flames, chanting, "This is number 1, and the fun has just begun. Burn it down, burn it down, burn it down." For the first time, underground newspapers began publishing instructions on the making of Molotov cocktails. Homemade bomb-making manuals began circulating at SDS meetings and rock concerts. A rash of bombings occurred in Detroit that winter. Small devices exploded 5 times outside the city halls in Oakland and San Francisco. To apocalyptic revolutionaries, it was a sign of the coming conflict. In Chicago, J.J. and Dorn were emboldened. By the spring, when they relocated to a Spartan apartment on North Winthrop Avenue, J.J., it was said, had demolished their furniture in an LSD rampage. Their circle had begun to think of themselves as the future of SDS and of the movement. They planned to run for all the top leadership positions at the SDS convention that June. But to win, they would need to defeat a set of rivals who were, if anything, even more strident and doctrinaire than they. A hardcore Maoist group called Progressive Labor, known as PL. As a statement of principles and a way of contrasting themselves with PL, they began writing what would become a defining 16,000-word manifesto, the infamous Weatherman paper. Chewing amphetamines like gum, JJ banged out most of it on a typewriter in the kitchen, passing around pages for the others to review. When they were done, he and 10 others, including Dorn, Mark Rudd, Jeff Jones, Howie Machtinger, Jim Mellon, Terry Robbins, and Bill Ayers, signed their names. So let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people. No more than 10 people. Tiny, tiny groups. One Weatherman history terms the paper a nearly impenetrable blizzard of Marxist jargon, an almost mystical vision of a coming political Armageddon. Any close reading of the Weatherman paper, one SDSer quipped, will drive you blind. A crystallization of all of JJ's pet ideas, the paper didn't just draw parallels between American student protests and the Third World guerrilla campaigns sprouting up around the world. It judged them all part and parcel of a single titanic global struggle between oppressed minorities and the agencies of U.S. imperialism. In other words, Mark Rudd hadn't just acted like Che at Columbia, he was, in fact, Che's comrade in arms. But the genius of JJ's argument was that it allowed white radicals to portray themselves as allies of these oppressed minorities by rallying behind the one group whose leaders, from Martin Luther King to Huey Newton, the JJs of the world adored even more than Che Guevara, American blacks. I think in our hearts, what all of us wanted to be, former SDS leader Kathy Wilkerson recalls, was a Black Panther. Wars like Vietnam came and went, but it was only the brewing revolution of American blacks, J.J. prophesied, that had the potential to destroy the country. Every white revolutionary, he argued, was duty-bound to become 1969's version of John Brown, the Civil War-era anti-slavery zealot. John Brown, live like him, became J.J.'s rallying cry. What this meant in reality was, like most protest-era rhetoric, open to interpretation. In the minds of apocalyptic radicals like J.J., white American protesters were destined to become Che-style guerrillas in the streets of America, rallying blacks and the white working class to a bloody revolution. For J.J. and his allies, talk of violence was no longer abstract. They wanted to bomb buildings and kill the policemen who were murdering blacks in the ghettos. Not many, it should be emphasized, shared this view. More than a few, even within the movement, thought talk of anti-government violence was lunacy. J.J.'s group decided to name its manifesto after a Bob Dylan line. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. Saner SDSers twisted this into a memorable quip. You don't need a rectal thermometer to know who the assholes are. The SDS convention took place at the Chicago Coliseum on Wednesday, June 18, 1969. Nearly 2,000 people attended. The Weathermen arrived as part of the larger RYM, Revolutionary Youth Movement, caucus. But both were consumed with the battle against their arch-rivals, PL. The basic difference between the two groups was that PL adopted a Maoist philosophy focusing on workers, while Weatherman put its emphasis on the oppressed, especially blacks. The convention's first 2 days were consumed with the trappings of student leftist gatherings, angry speeches, PL chants against RYM chants against PL, even fistfights. The turning point came on Friday night, when a delegate from the Black Panthers took the microphone and read a statement that condemned PL as a counter-revolutionary traitors, who, if their ideological positions did not change, would be dealt with as such. It amounted to an ultimatum from the Panthers, whose approval SDS leaders sought like lost gold. Dump PL or else. PLers tried to drown out the Panthers, chanting, "Read Mao" and "Bullshit." When RYM supporters chanted the Panther slogan, "Power to the people," PLers shouted back, "Power to the workers." Fistfights broke out. On stage, Mark Rudd called for a recess. As he finished, Dorn rushed to the rostrum, eyes ablaze, and shouted that it was time to decide whether they could remain in the same organization as those who denied human rights to the oppressed. Anyone who agreed, she announced, should follow her. And with that, Dorn and the leadership marched into an adjacent area to decide what to do next. The RYM caucus and its allies, maybe 600 people, talked there for 3 hours, then resumed discussions Saturday morning. The debates lasted all that day. Finally, Dorn, pacing between a set of bleachers, delivered a slow, deliberate speech that detailed the case for expelling PL from the SDS. We are not a caucus, she concluded. We are SDS. And with that, a vote was taken. By a 5-1 margin, PL was expelled. The leadership, led by Dorn and Bill Ayers, then drafted a statement listing the reasons why. Around 11, everyone filed back into the main hall, and Dorn strode to the rostrum. For 20 minutes, she laid out every PL sin, real and imagined, terming the group reactionary, anti-communist, and objectively racist. When she announced PL's expulsion, chaos ensued. PLers chanted, "Shame! Shame!" Dorn led the RYM caucus out of the auditorium, leading their own chants, "Power to the people," and "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh." By Sunday, confusion reigned. the PLers, refusing to acknowledge their expulsion, elected their own SDS leadership. At a church across town, the RYM caucus elected theirs, all prominent Weathermen. Mark Rudd as National Secretary, Bill Ayers as Education Secretary, Jeff Jones as the Interorganizational Secretary. Why is it always a church with these people? Like, they always go to a church to go organize. It's very strange why they can do that. It's probably maybe because it's just an open building that they can go to. That's if they know that they can get in. Anyway, I'm not the first person to notice that pattern where communists are going to organize at churches. Like, even Glenn Beck mentioned this, like, back on one of his famous Fox News things back in the day. It's just all interesting to note. Where was I? Oh, yes. By Monday morning, there were, in effect, 2 functioning SDSs, but everyone understood that Weatherman had carried the day, in large part because its members had taken control of the national office in the days before the convention. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Weatherman possessed the national office, and so it possessed SDS. But in name only. The Weathermen who took control of SDS that summer envisioned an SDS unlike any other protest group before or since. Gone was the idea of a national office as a shaggy bureaucracy to guide SDS's far-flung chapters. In its place, the Weathermen became, in effect, an Uber chapter of their own, one dedicated to the leadership's twin goals. The first was fanning out across the country to recruit members of the working class. The second was melding recruits with existing Weathermen for a massive protest march planned for October in which the new, far larger group would make its political debut. Storming the streets of Chicago in an all-out attack on the police and symbols of government authority. They built it as the National Action, but in time it would become known as the Days of Rage. Weatherman was born into Richard Nixon's divided America in the final years of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. It was a country and a time in which dissenters were watched and wiretapped by stern federal agents with spit-shined shoes and little patience for long-haired kids who mused about bombing government buildings. 2 million people marched in anti-war demonstrations in the autumn of 1969 alone. Images of angry demonstrators jamming the nightly news broadcasts where a fatherly Walter Cronkite warned Middle America that the country was coming apart at the seams. President Nixon, who gained office that January, in large part on his promise to crack down on protesters, had no doubt that it was. And from his first days in office, he pushed the FBI to do everything possible to undermine the anti-war movement. Even before Nixon, the Bureau had been doing exactly that, engaging in a broad harassment campaign against radicals, white and black alike, called COINTELPRO, which consisted of everything from break-ins to fake letters intended to sow discord among protest groups. Think of that. That is interesting. Fake letters intended to sow discord among protest groups. How interesting. What's the modern equivalent of that, I wonder? Writing a spicy tweet. Throwing a Substack grenade. Something to think about. Weatherman had been on the FBI's radar from its inception. Months before its leaders began planning a campaign of underground violence, the FBI sensed the threat it posed. In September 1969, Hoover's right-hand man, William Sullivan, warned that Weatherman had the potential to be far more damaging to the security of this nation than the Communist Party ever was, even at the height of its strength in the 1930s. Debatable. For the moment, though, there wasn't much the FBI was able to do to counter Weatherman. Agents tried to recruit informants who might signal the group's plans. but they were all but impossible to come by. Few in the movement wanted anything to do with the FBI. Again and again, FBI memoranda moaned about the Bureau's inability to develop a single decent informant. As one agent complained, Weathermen's degenerate living habits, their immoral conduct, and their use of drugs made it extremely difficult to find informants who fit this mold and are willing to live as they do. That fall, the Bureau's Cincinnati office was able to insert a single informant into Weatherman's local branch, a man named Larry Grathwohl, who would in time provide a glimpse into the group's inner workings. Now, see, this is very interesting as well, because this is a natural form of gatekeeping, isn't it? Right? A very natural and built-in form of gatekeeping. You're not going to get a conservative gumshoe to go live as the hippies do, right? To go, go where the wild things are, as you might say. Yeah. So, but what's the equivalent, right? One of the reasons I wanted to bring this work to people was because I want people to see these patterns of I guess you might say dissident groups or of people who are dissidents and who try organization and try doing stuff. It means that you have to understand that the pattern basically doesn't change, right? And so what is the dissident right or the alt-right or whatever type of thing you want to call this thing of ours? What is our way of gatekeeping people? Is it using is it racism? Is it saying nigger? I mean, yeah, using gamer words is our form of gatekeeping. Anyway, just that'd be interesting to think about, Oh, hey, how's it going, Minnow? Good to see you. We'll continue on. Without informants, the Bureau, led by its Chicago office, relied on wiretaps to keep track of Dorn and the others. The 28-year-old agent who eventually headed the FBI's Weatherman investigations, William Dyson, began his wiretapping duties that summer, manning a set of taps every day from 4 to midnight in a windowless room deep in the Chicago Bureau's building. I watched them become the Weathermen, Dyson remembered years later. I was with them when they became the Weathermen. It was exciting. I was watching history. I knew more about these people than they knew about themselves. I mean, well, hello there, fellow federal informants. I mean, do you think that this doesn't go on today? You think that like Twitter streams don't have like your local FBI agent under an anonymous account, using a burner email, like listening to what like Richard Spencer has to say? You think that doesn't happen? Come on. Yeah, it's like you're the one person listening to the stream is probably my federal agent. Anyway, moving on. While the FBI lingered in the shadows, the day-to-day responsibility for monitoring Weathermen fell to the Mayor Richard Daley's Chicago police. In the days when U.S. police departments viewed harassing student protesters as part of their daily jobs, the Chicago force employed an especially nasty Red Squad that relentlessly targeted the Weathermen, staking out the national office, following the leadership at all hours, and sometimes arresting them. Dorn and JJ, for example, spent a night in jail after police found drugs in their car at a traffic stop. In one memorable episode, a Columbia Weatherman named Robbie Roth, who would later become one of the Weather Underground's 5 leaders, was sitting in a third-floor apartment with 2 young women when a trio of detectives appeared at the door and began questioning them. Roth sensed that the man had been drinking. He could smell it on their breath. The climax of his investigation, Roth says, came when the three pushed him out a window and dangled him by his ankles. One of Dorn's friends, an earnest activist named Russell Neufeld, experienced an even more harrowing brush with the Chicago police. Arrested with two other Weathermen at a demonstration outside the federal building on September 26th, Neufeld was dragged inside nearby police headquarters. I was standing there with a guy named Joe Kelly, and these cops put 38 caliber guns in our mouths and said if we moved, they would blow our brains out, Neufeld recalls. Then they took Danny Cohen and pistol whipped him. I swear, they broke every bone in Danny's face, blood everywhere. Joey and I stood there with guns in our mouths, forced to watch. It was horrible. While the FBI and Chicago police looked on, the new Weathermen leaders of SDS embarked on an uproarious 6-month period, the second half of 1969, that would come to define them. It was then that the group's most bizarre behaviors took place. The street brawls, the women running topless through high schools, the forced breakups of Weathermen's couples, the orgies. All of it was designed to transform Weatherman's 500 or so core followers into the makings of JJ's dream, an urban fighting force to rally the working class toward revolution. Almost everything that happened that summer and fall, in fact, was designed in some way to toughen up a band of coffeehouse intellectuals, whose only experience with actual violence, other than watching the Battle of Algiers, was throwing the occasional rock during a street demonstration. We have one task, Bill Ayers announced at meeting after meeting, and that is to make ourselves into tools of the revolution. The idea wasn't to go underground. Not yet, anyway. For the moment, the focus was to be on recruiting, violent street demonstration, and, come the fall, the days of rage in Chicago. Right, so what all of this stuff why this stuff is being performed is very clear here. And of course, as Burrough says, this is to toughen people up. You need to basically, any sort of military training or indoctrination or preparation for any sort of like violent action requires the breaking down of individual identities and the reconstructing and rebuilding of those identities as a part of a cogent and cohesive group. That's basically what JJ is doing here, in very left-wing fashion, and using, of course, the left-wing and 1960s like social and sexual theory, right? So, of course, like I've said before, he is deliberately, especially with the sex thing, right? So you're breaking up the couples and forcing people into orgies. So, like, just think of what this is doing to like a woman's psychology, right? You know, you're not a monogamous person. You are like just a cog, basically. You're a tool that can be passed around and shared, essentially. And like sexually, that's kind of, it's very degrading, and it's degrading on purpose, right? Any sort of military training that is undergone is intentionally degrading and intentionally hard for this purpose and for this reason, right? A few outside Weathermen itself thought that any of this, especially the days of rage, made much sense. When Mark Rudd met with leaders of the group that organized the largest mass protests of the era, the National Mobilization Committee, the MOB, they adamantly refused to join forces, arguing that street fighting and battling police were counterproductive. The Panthers, too, thought the days of rage a bad idea. The Chicago Panthers' charismatic young leader, Fred Hampton, held shouting matches with Dorn and other leaders. The Panthers refused to help. And Hampton actually went public with his opposition, calling the days of rage custoristic. Custoristic, that's a crazy word there. Interesting, very interesting word. Hello, everybody in the chat. Thank you. Finally getting comments only an hour later. All right, let's see here. Yes, well, how come you're not a moderator on my channel yet? Let me change that. Hold on. There we go. There we go. Yeah, hello, Cody Bassett. Good to see you. All right, where was I here? Custoristic, yes. Inside Weatherman, especially in its male-dominated upper reaches, the surest way to lose face was to share these doubts. JJ set a macho tone, and a number of those who trailed in his wake, including Bill Ayers, Terry Robbins, and Howie Maxtinger, were short, young men who seemed to compensate by adopting facades of arrogant swagger, scoffing at anyone who dared question weather dogma. Several of them had begun carrying guns. When Rudd made the mistake of questioning the days of rage, Ayers and Robbins snorted. How could you succumb to that liberal bullshit? Robbins demanded. We've got to do it. It's the only strategy to build a revolution. As Rudd wrote later, the scene plays in my memory like a B-grade gangster flick. Billy looks on in smirking contempt as Terry dismisses me with a flick of his ever-present cigarette. How could you be so weak? That settled it. I mean, it's funny because it says there are other patterns that you notice too, right? Like the manlet theory of history seems to be vindicated here as well because they're all short guys. It's interesting. Oh, the patterns of history repeat over and over again more times than you could possibly imagine. Yet even those who Weathermen wanted most to emulate, the leaders of revolutionary Cuba, had their doubts. The extent of Weathermen's ties to the Cuban government has been a source of speculation for more than 40 years, the subject of multiple FBI investigations that ended up proving little. It is clear that several Weathermen, including Ayers, enjoyed contacts with Cuban diplomats in New York and Canada that would endure for years to come. The genesis of the relationship can be traced at least to the days immediately after Weatherman took control of SDS, when Dorn led the group, part of a larger delegation of protesters in an extended visit to Havana. The Cubans treated Dorn like visiting royalty, featuring her in government magazines and introducing her to dignitaries from throughout the revolutionary world. The highlight of the visit was a meeting with a delegation from North Vietnam, which seemed far more eager to discuss formation of a Viet Cong-style underground in America than half measures like street fighting. Even as they lectured Dorn on ways this underground could be formed, they cautioned her about not getting too far ahead of the masses. In Mark Rudd's words, which was exactly what Weatherman was doing. In the end, after giving the Weathermen rings forged from the metal of downed U.S. fighter planes, a North Vietnamese delegate simply urged the Weathermen to do their best. The war is entering its final phase, he told Dorn. You must begin to wage armed struggle as soon as possible to become the vanguard and take leadership of the revolution. Back in the United States, JJ and the other new SDS leaders were already preparing the ground. Within days of their convention victory, detachments of Weathermen, more than 200 in all, began arriving in cities across the country. 30 both in Seattle and New York, 25 in Columbus, Ohio, 15 in Denver, plus smaller groups scattered throughout the Midwest, in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. In each, members lived together in collectives. The leadership, based in Chicago and now known as the Weather Bureau, JJ, Rudd, Ayers, Jeff Jones, and others, traveled with them, leading the collectives in increasingly outlandish protests aimed at rallying the working class, to whom they referred as greasers, or more commonly, the grease. Their most common tactic was a series of invasions they mounted of blue-collar high schools and of community colleges, in which weathermen ran through the halls screaming and urging students to join them at the Days of Rage. In August, in the Detroit suburb of Warren, a group of weatherwomen took over a classroom at Macomb Community College during exams and lectured the 30 or so confused students on the evils of racism and imperialism. When the teacher called the police, the weatherwomen were arrested. A month later, in Pittsburgh, 26 weatherwomen stormed the halls of South Hills High School, tossing leaflets, waving a North Vietnamese flag, and when this didn't sufficiently engage male students, lifting their skirts and exposing their breasts. Once again, most of the weatherwomen ended up in jail, as it should be. I mean, it's also really funny because, like, everybody who's been online and focused on politics for the last 10 years or so has this picture of a leftist female protester who's always topless. Like, every single time they're always topless, they're always nude, right? I mean, this is I guess you might say the first time that I'm aware of that this is like the convention of female protesting. All through July, August, and into September, weathermen led similar protests around the country, brawling with PLers in Boston and New York and fighting with police in Seattle and in Detroit, where on September 27th, JJ led a march of 60 weathermen that turned violent, the protesters pelting police with rocks and bottles. These actions were successful insofar as they boosted morale in the ranks and created a sense that Weatherman was actually doing something. The problem, it soon became apparent, was that, for all the effort, Weatherman wasn't finding much of anyone in the working class who wanted to join its revolution. In several cases, its representatives ended up in shoving matches with the very people they were trying to befriend. When Mark Rudd tried to recruit a band of tough-looking teens at a Milwaukee hamburger joint, they beat him so badly he had to be hospitalized. I mean, this is like the stone toss meme every single time, right? Stone toss doesn't fucking miss. Like every single time, like the working class white is like, oh sure, thanks friend for helping, like the working class and such, and then like immediately they get kicked out for being too bourgeois. Or being too socially conservative. Rudd, in fact, though he was still the symbol of SDS to many, was proving a less than inspiring leader. A telling snapshot, offered in Kirkpatrick Sale's SDS, came during his appearance at Columbia on September 25th, in a speech in which he implored the audience to prepare for the revolution. "I've got myself a gun. Has everyone here got a gun?" Rudd all but sneered. "Anyone? No? Well, you'd better fucking get your shit together." When a non-Weatherman SDSer named Paul Rockwell approached the stage, insisting he had heard enough, Rudd took 2 menacing steps toward him. Rockwell barreled into Rudd and slammed him into the podium, at which point Rudd simply shrugged and slunk to one side of the stage. Rudd's face was a picture of stunned fear. Sale wrote, all his rhetoric having done nothing to overcome his ingrained middle-class unfamiliarity with, and anxiety about, violence. Yes, Cody Bassett, you're not wrong. It's always been the same tactics every single time. It's always the same. Rudd could see his stock falling. With every passing day, power and influence were passing to the more aggressive leaders, Jeff Jones, Terry Robbins, and especially Bernardine Dorn, who, as the leadership's sole female, seemed to hold every other Weatherman leader in thrall. Power doesn't flow out of the barrel of a gun. Rudd snarled at Dorn during one Weather Bureau meeting. Power flows out of Bernardine's cunt. Well, I mean, he's not wrong, and as we continue into the rest of this book, you'll see exactly that's basically true. And there is a turn away from more masculine forms of revolution, um, which we will get to that in later chapters. The heart of Weatherman's work remained in Chicago, where the leadership and their friends lived together in groups of 5 and 6. The brutality they experienced there, especially from the Chicago police, but also from others, would have a powerful impact on their eventual decision to go underground. One of Jeff Jones' friends, Jonathan Lerner, was given control of the National Office, a set of second-story rooms at 1608 West Madison on the edge of a ghetto. Lerner's tiny staff paid the bills, answered mail, and put out the SDS newspaper, New Left Notes. The office was a terrifying place, Lerner recalls. The presence of the cops was constant, sitting outside, following us to the bank. We were under siege by this group of black boys, 10, 11 years old. They would come to the fire escapes, race through, and steal people's purses. I mean, just imagine that, a bunch of young black men stealing purses. I mean, who would have thought? It was absurd. Eventually, we boarded all the windows to keep the kids out, put bolts on all the doors, and built a metal cage like an airlock to get in. None of it helped. I mean, I guess you can't build them out. You just... I mean, this is so interesting to me that they don't have deadbolts on their doors. Like, what? Why? Like, you're telling me you have like a cheap fucking little piece of shit lock that can be like broken into, right? I mean, I suppose this is the day before they have those little like face plates for doors and things like that. I used to know what they were called, but I can't remember what they're off the top of my head what they're called now. But I mean, like, why don't you have airlocks or why don't you have deadbolts on your doors? Like, this is a basic security. Another danger, though the leadership never published it, was the Panthers, whose offices were several blocks away. If SDS was a focus of police harassment, the Chicago Panthers were approaching open war with the police. Their derelict offices were regularly raided. Their members stopped and frisked on an hourly basis. The Weathermen idolized the Panthers, but the relationship fast deteriorated. The Panthers were in a stage of total madness, recalls Lerner. As those months went on, as they became more paranoid and more crazy, they kind of took it out on us. To them, our offices were much bigger, much nicer than theirs. We had lots of equipment, and cars, and the printing press. It rapidly developed into this rip-off relationship. That was emotionally horrible. You couldn't dare question it politically. It was completely insane. Tensions climaxed when a group of Panthers stormed the SDS office, jammed a gun into a girl's face, beat up the SDS printer, Ron Fliegelman, and ransacked the office, making off with typewriters and other equipment. Afterward, Bernardine Dorn and others went to the Panther offices to complain, Lerner recalls, and were basically kicked down the stairs. Legalman. Well, I mean, I don't know if he's a lawyer, but it sounds like a very lawyer name, doesn't it? Yeah, this is also very interesting too, because like the white radicals obviously have stuff and the blacks don't, and like they're coming to them. I mean, this rip-off relationship, the way that they describe it sounds like, I mean, they're being politically and morally obligated to offer Gibbs, essentially, like Gibbs, always about Gibbs with these people. Like, oh, you guys have nice cars, the police aren't raiding you every day. Okay. For all the threats of political violence, however, the emotional violence Weathermen unleashed among themselves proved even more destructive. Throughout this period, the Weather Bureau issued a series of directives designed to mold every individual weatherman or cadre into a revolutionary combatant. The most grueling of these practices, borrowed from the Maoist Chinese, was known as criticism or self-criticism, essentially a marathon all-night interrogation in which members were accused of every conceivable inhuman weakness, from cowardice to insubordination. For many, these sessions were too much. Dozens of weathermen left the group as a result. This was the point, to weed out the weak and the unready, to break down all traces of individualism and transform the deponent into a tough, obedient, unquestioning soldier. Another initiative, which actually originated with a group of Detroit weather women, was the Smash Monogamy Program, which ordained that every member of Weathermen break up with his or her romantic partner. The idea, again, was to sever individual weathermen from every meaningful relationship except that with the group itself. Scores of weather couples were forced to break up, though it was noted that Dorn always seemed exempt. While she and JJ did break up during this period, Dorn began an extended monogamous relationship with Jeff Jones. It's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. You're not wrong is, and of course, I'm not sure if that has been said yet. I don't think it's mentioned later, but Bernadine Dorn, actually by background, is a Mischling. She's half Jewish, half Midwest German, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm just going to stop and for a moment and reflect on the nature of her particular background here and why this category of individuals is so sought after by the left. Not just like a Mischling type, but a mixed race person. And the reason why is, like as I've heard, psychologically they are they don't know exactly where they fit in. They're in between communities. They have a mixed heritage, so like they just are never. They're never sure exactly where they stand, and so they have a tendency to take a lot more risks in the attempt to fit in. So, of course, it makes a lot of sense that somebody like a Bernardine Dorn is engaging in incredibly risky forms of behavior, not just in terms of like engaging in criminal action, but taking an extremely radical political stance and a violent political stance at that, an extremist stance, and also engaging in very risky sexual practices. The Smash Monogamy Program led to Weatherman's most notorious initiative, orgies. The idea was to break down the last remaining personal barriers. As Terry Robbins put it, people who fuck together, fight together. One of the first, called the National Orgy, occurred in Columbus, Ohio, during a visit by the leadership. We were doing booze, dope, and dancing. A weatherman named Jerry Long recalled. And suddenly you could see the wheels turning in people's minds. Will it happen? When? How to get started? We knew it wouldn't happen of its own accord. Somebody had to do something about it. We were constantly talking about asserting leadership in ambiguous situations, and here was a case in point. After a while, Jeff Jones went upstairs to the attic, where the mattresses were, with an old girlfriend. JJ sees them go up and follows, taking off his clothes too and lying down beside them. Finally, Billy, Ayers, yells, "It's time to do it," and takes the hand of the woman he's been dancing with and goes up too. Within minutes, there was a whole group of naked people looking down from the head of the stairs saying, "Come on up." I took the hand of this girl and exchanged a few pleasantries to give it a slightly personal quality, and then we fucked. And there were people fucking and thrashing around all over. They'd sort of roll over on you, And sometimes you found yourself spread over more than one person. The room was like some modern sculpture. There'd be all these humps in a row. Yeah, I bet there were humps in a row. You'd see a knee and then buttocks, and then three knees and four buttocks. They were all moving up and down, rolling around. The next day, there was a lingering awkwardness, Long recalls, until one woman piped up, "I'm sure they have to do it this way in Vietnam." God, even after that, the women are still incredibly like naive, right? This is just pure naivete. I was one of the people who instigated the orgies. One in Chicago, one I remember after a demonstration in Washington in November, recalls John Lerner, who was in the process of coming out. Billy Ayres and I were the leaders in DC. After the demonstration, about 30 of us came back to this house. Somebody had a bunch of acid. We sort of said, let's all drop acid and have an orgy. So we did. For me, it was sort of liberating because I got a chance to have sex with some of the men I was after. The creepy thing was, I have a memory of several women who came out as lesbians having their first sex with women, and it was weird because everyone was sitting around watching. There were people who clearly didn't want to be there, standing on the sidelines, legs crossed. It was basically creepy. Yeah, of course it was. Of course it was freaking creepy. God damn it, I hate comment! God damn it, Yid. Hippies don't have money. Weatherman's taste for orgies proved short-lived, petering out within months. Mark Rudd thought all the sexual experimentation, from smash monogamy to orgies to homosexuality, was disastrous, fostering petty jealousies, driving people out of the collectives, and introducing a level of sexual confusion that did little to focus cadres on the revolution. Worst of all, he recalls, was a resulting epidemic of sexually transmitted diseases, from gonorrhea and pelvic inflammatory disease. Pelvic inflammatory disease? What the fuck is even pelvic inflammatory disease? What even is that? I have to do not research. To crab lice and genital infections they called weather crud. Oh my god. these people were so fucking horny that they made a fucking they have their own fucking genital infection. For Rudd, the final straw came when he was having sex with a woman and noticed a crab in her eyebrow. Oh, so fucking gross. That's disgusting. Like, these people are just dirty, nasty, disgusting hippies who don't shower. And I'm sure these people have like the are stereotypical as well. They don't have like the greatest of personal hygiene either. All of it. The organizing and recruiting, the orgies, the escalating violence. Climaxed at the Days of Rage in October. Weathermen leaders crisscrossed the country, giving interviews in which they predicted it would be the largest, most violent mass protest the movement had seen. Something on par with an urban Armageddon. As Mark Rudd told an Ohio television station, thousands and thousands of protesters were coming to Chicago to fight back, to fight the government, to fight their agents, the police. Exactly what they meant, no one was entirely sure. Yes, it is certainly, after that, it is certainly time for the heavy flamers. Exterminatus mode, We're not urging anybody to bring guns to Chicago, Bill Ayres said at the time. We're not urging anybody to shoot from a crowd. But we're also going to make it clear that when a pig gets iced, that's a good thing. And that everyone who considers himself a revolutionary should be armed, should own a gun. 2 nights before the protest, Leadership sent a team to detonate Weatherman's first bomb, a small one that destroyed the 10-foot bronze statue of a policeman in Haymarket Square, the site of the violent 1886 labor rally in which 11 people, 7 of them policemen, were killed. After the weather bomb went off, a Union official vowed that police were ready to meet violence head-on. "We now feel," he said, "that it's kill or be killed." After months of speech-making and posturing, the long-awaited Days of Rage began on a cool Wednesday night, October 8th, 1969, on a rise at the southern end of Lincoln Park. At dusk, the Weathermen began gathering around a bonfire. Most of the leadership, Dorn, Bill Ayers, Jeff Jones, all ready for battle. Then they waited and waited and waited. By nightfall, it was clear something was wrong. Thousands had been expected. At best, 200 people had shown up, almost all of them veteran weathermen. Everyone stood around blinking, vaguely embarrassed, until one young man, glancing around nervously, muttered, "This is an awful small group to start a revolution." Small, but ready for havoc. Most were wearing some kind of helmet, goggles, or gas mask. Beneath their clothes they had lead pipes, chains, blackjacks, and their emergency contact information. At 10:25 p.m., after several desultory speeches, Jeff Jones stepped into the firefight and shouted the code words, "I am Marion Delgado," evoking the name of a 5-year-old California boy who in 1947 had placed a concrete block on railroad tracks to derail an oncoming locomotive. With that, amid a volley of war whoops and echoing ululations, a bit of street theater taken directly from the Battle of Algiers, the attack began, some 200 weathermen running from the park into the wealthy neighborhoods known as the Gold Coast. Chanting "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh," they tossed bricks through the bay windows of chandeliered apartment houses and bashed the windshields of dozens of cars. Racing toward downtown, they smashed more windows at the Astor Tower Hotel, the Park Dearborn Hotel, and the Lakeshore Apartments. High above, a few irked residents threw ashtrays and flower pots. The police, dozens of whom had been lining Lincoln Park, were caught off guard. They had assumed that the demonstration would take place inside the park. Scrambling to stop the surging protesters, police managed to erect a roadblock in front of the Drake Hotel. Seeing it, the charging weathermen veered a block east, then ran south into another roadblock, this one manned by 30 helmeted police officers. A melee ensued. 30 protesters were beaten to the pavement. Others broke through and split into groups, which the police ran down, truncheons swinging, gunshots fired. 6 weathermen were shot, none seriously. Dozens were hauled off to jail. By midnight, it was over. Ah, well, apparently these communists had a bedtime. Sad. It took 3 days to bail many out of jail. The Weathermen contingent, once again 200 strong, reassembled on Saturday, at first marching peacefully through downtown streets past double lines of Mayor Daley's finest. At a signal, the war whoops rose again, and they broke into a run, swinging pipes at car windshields and chucking rocks. They never had a chance. This time, uniformed officers, augmented by plainclothes detectives, appeared at every corner, mercilessly beating everyone with long hair until they fell, bloodied, into the gutters. Based. More than 120 people were arrested. Based. This time, someone was seriously hurt. A city attorney named Richard Elrod, who charged at a weatherman named Bryan Flanagan, lost his balance and hit his head, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. Flanagan was indicted and later turned himself in. A jury eventually found him not guilty. Damn it is. I mean, just imagine a city attorney who's like getting involved in the street violence on behalf of the cops. Like, imagine that. Like would that happen today in a big city? No. In fact, the city attorney would probably be like on the side of the Weatherman. It was, all in all, a humiliating debut for Weathermen. Bail bonds alone cost SDS $2.3 million. All the group's top leaders were arrested and now faced criminal charges, typically assault and incitement to riot. I mean, yeah. But the Days of Rage event did achieve something important. It marked Weatherman as the leading player on the heavy edge of the new left, the furthest left, the wildest, the craziest, the most committed. The leadership chose to declare victory. The next issue of the New Left Notes argued, "We came to Chicago to join the other side, to do material damage to Pig America," spelled with a K, by the way. They spell America with a K. "And all that it's about. To do it in the road, in the open, so that white America could dig on the opening of a new front, to attack, to vamp on those privileges and destroy the motherfucker from the inside. We did what we set out to do, and in the process turned a corner." Of course, now they're like all caps posting here. It's literally, this next paragraph's all in caps. "From here on, it's one battle after another, with white youth joining in the fight and taking the necessary risks. Pig America, beware. There's an army growing in your guts, and it's going to bring you down." "The Days of Rage was really a shock to us, that nobody came but us," recalls John Lerner. "You know, we didn't step back and take a sober view of it. We took a reactive view, which was, well, if we're the only people who will do this, it's us against the world. And after that, it was." The decision to go underground, says Russell Neufeld, was largely a function of what happened to us in Chicago, the violence, the brutality. Things like getting a gun put in your mouth. It convinced a lot of us we really were living in a police state. Going underground seemed the next logical step. It appears that the Weather Bureau decided to abolish SDS and go underground in the days immediately after the Days of Rage. The decision had certainly been made by the time the leadership gathered 10 days later for a post-mortem in a pair of cabins they rented in White Pines Forest State Park in northern Illinois. Of those present, only Mark Rudd and Jim Mellon have given partial accounts, and both recall that the decision to go underground, to, in effect, attempt a Cuban-style revolution in the United States, was presented to them as a fait accompli. Both voiced doubts, suggesting that the Days of Rage had been a failure, and that it might be time to reconnect with a movement they were turning their backs on. Both were dismissed out of hand. As Mellon remembered it, the argument, as usual, was in personal terms. "I didn't have the character to be a revolutionary. I lacked audacity. I couldn't do it. When I tried to point out that military action required exactly the kind of discipline that we'd rejected, and a technical capacity, in other words, bomb making, we'd never bothered to master, JJ looked at me and said, 'Jim here is from the 6 months in the library school of sabotage.' Everybody laughed, and that was that." In a 2011 interview for this book, Rudd remembered being stunned by the sudden shift in strategy. They had mused about going underground for months. Every self-styled revolutionary had, but Rudd had never truly believed they would go through with it. Just as startling, he says, was how the message was delivered, by Bernardine Dorn with preternatural cool, as if she were suggesting we go for supper. As Rudd recalled it, Dorn said, "We've learned from Che that the only way to make revolution is to actually begin armed struggle. This is what we've been waiting for. The next step after the national action is to move to a higher level of struggle, to build the underground. Street violence is an unsustainable tactic. It makes us too vulnerable and costs too much. We've got to be able to work clandestinely." Rudd couldn't believe it. They were planning to initiate actual violence, actual bombings, actual sabotage. It was surreal. Almost as shocking was Dorn's final message. Weathermen's Underground would be organized not by the Weather Bureau, but by a new subset of leadership they were calling the Front Four. Dorn herself, JJ, Jeff Jones, and the pugnacious Terry Robbins. All the others, Rudd, Mellon, Howie Machtinger, even Bill Ayers, would be relegated to secondary status. Only later would many of them realize that the crucial component in this equation was the little-known Robbins, that in the words of the writers Peter Collier and David Horowitz, who published a history of Weathermen in Rolling Stone in 1982, there was a subtle passing of the torch from JJ, Weatherman's thinker, to Terry, who had proposed himself as Weatherman's doer. One Weatherman told them JJ had these fantasies, but it was Terry who was prepared to act them out. It was a faithful choice. To that point, Robbins had been a marginal member of leadership, an SDS stalwart best known as Ayers' best friend. A chain smoker, small, dark, and intense, Robbins came across to friends as warm and funny, as the sensitive poet he was. Others, noting his caustic humor and macho posturing, found him, in the words of a Weatherman ally, Jonah Raskin, menacing. Robbins was younger than the rest, having just turned 22, but he talked tougher than almost anyone. He was the perfect fist at the end of JJ's arm, endlessly preoccupied, obsessed, some would say, with underground warfare. He would scribble bomb designs and ideas for sabotage in a notebook, remembered by Bill Ayers in his 2001 memoir, Fugitive Days. Terry studied the Blaster's Handbook, a publication of the Explosives Department of E.I. DuPont Corporation. His cranky notebook pen lying on the ratty sofa, each inflamed sketch coiled tight, busy with detail, poised to detonate on the page. Pressure trigger device, nipple time bomb, magnifying glass bomb, cigarette fuse, alarm clock time bomb, homemade grenade, walking booby trap, Bangalore torpedo, book trap, pressure release gate trap, loose floorboard traps, whistle and pipe traps. There were detailed drawings of bridges, slab bridge, T-beam bridge, concrete cantilever bridge, truss bridge, suspension bridge, with wild X's indicating the pattern of placements that would drop every goddamn thing into the water or the ravine below, and architectural sketches of the skeletons of numerous buildings with the requisite accompanying fury of X's designed to doom the thing, reduce it to chaos. There were maps of highways with notes on sabotage and destruction. Page after page was piled with calculated steps for making high explosives with all but indecipherable formulae. The formula for nitroglycerin, the formula for mercury fulminate, for dynamite, for chloride of azode, for ammonium nitrate, for black powder. "The pigs need a strong dose of their own medicine," Terry said grimly, shoved down their throats. "And up their asses, too. A napalm enema for Nixon." In retrospect, others would... It's always fucking... But with these people, like, they have this always fucking anal shit with these fuckers. Every time. In retrospect, Others would remember an inescapable air of violence that hung over Robbins. He came from a broken family and hinted that there had been violence. One of his many girlfriends later came forward to say he beat her. But what troubled some, including his principal lover that winter, Kathy Wilkerson, wasn't so much his comfort with violence as his preoccupation with death. He was constantly talking about the need for Weathermen to give their lives for the revolution, how he was willing to die for the struggle. His favorite movie that season was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and his favorite scene was the last, when the two outlaws meet their fate charging headlong into a volley of bullets. More than one Weatherman alumnus discussing Robbins uses the term death wish. After the postmortem, the leadership scattered, some, like Bill Ayers, heading to a massive anti-war demonstration in Washington, and others, like Mark Rudd, touring the collectives, making sure everyone understood leadership's latest pronouncements while assessing each cadre's capability for supervised violence. Weatherman's cult-like trappings, especially the withering crit, self-crit sessions, seemed to grow even more intense during this period, as leadership attempted to break down the last vestiges of individuality in its followers, who strived in turn to parade their combat readiness. One story, probably apocryphal, tells of a young Weatherman who strangled a cat in front of his peers to demonstrate his willingness to kill. Rudd wrote in his excellent 2009 memoir, Underground, "This was the most notorious Weatherman period. More group sex, LSD acid tests, orgiastic rock music, violent street actions, and constant self-criticism sessions. More orgies to prove our revolutionary love for each other. We were by now a classic cult, true believers surrounded by a hostile world that we rejected and that rejected us in return. We had a holy faith, revolution which could not be shaken, as well as a strategy to get there, the Foucault theory. We were the latest in a long line of revolutionaries from Mao to Fidel to Che to Ho Chi Minh, and the only white people prepared to engage in guerrilla warfare within the homeland." Then, just before dawn on the morning of December 4th, the moment that for many Weathermen erased any doubt about the rumors of going underground. The telephone calls ricocheted from apartment to apartment with stunning news. The Chicago police had murdered Panthers leader Fred Hampton in his bed. They had stormed the rooms where he and 8 other Panthers were staying. An FBI informant had slipped him a powerful barbiturate, and Hampton was still asleep beside his girlfriend when police shot him twice in the head. For once, radical propaganda was accurate. It amounted to an official assassination. Almost every Weatherman had the same thought. Am I next? Was this our Kristallnacht? Wilkerson wondered. When the Panthers opened Hampton's apartment to show his bloody mattress to the public, hundreds filed by in astonishment, including Dorn, Bill Ayers, and many other Weathermen. For most, it was the final straw, the moment when their intellectual grasp of armed struggle gave way to rage. It was the murder of Fred Hampton more than any other factor that compelled us to take up armed struggle. A Weatherman named David Gilbert wrote later, "At a viewing of the body, Ayers pulled off the ring a Vietnamese activist had given him and placed it in Hampton's hands. As Ayers wrote later, we are ready now, our dress rehearsal behind us, to plunge headlong into the whirlpool of violence." It was December 1969. Fred Hampton's murder was just one of a series of ominous events that heralded the nightmarish end of a tortured decade. 2 days later in Altamont, California, Hell's Angels knifed and killed a teenager in the unruly crowd watching Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones perform at the infamous concert. The papers were still jammed about with lurid stories of the massacre of 5 people at the hands of Charles Manson's hippie cult 4 months earlier. In later years, each of these events would be cited as the unofficial end of the Age of Aquarius, or the death of the 60s, or the passing of the Woodstock generation's dreams of love and hope. Yeah, sorry, I had to delete that comment because I can't on this channel. This is on YouTube, unfortunately, so I have to make sure that I don't endorse this sort of violence. And as I especially don't endorse the violence of police murdering people in their beds, of course. Anyway, even if they're communist radicals, but anyway, we have other punishments for that. But few gatherings illustrated the dark borderlands between the end of the 60s and the onset of the 70s more clearly than the one Weatherman held in the days between Christmas 1969 and New Year's 1970. Billed as the National War Council, or Wargasm, it was the pep rally from hell, a 5-day orgy of violent rhetoric intended to set the stage for the underground revolution the leadership was now ready to begin. It was held in a tumble-down dance hall in the heart of Flint, Michigan. Ghetto. A Flint, Michigan ghetto. That city, too. Always in Flint, Michigan. Something about that town. On his arrival, Mark Rudd, who continued to have doubts about their plans, fingered a hole in the plywood front door, the result of a shotgun slug that had killed a patron just the night before, and thought, how appropriate. The Detroit Collective had handled the decorations, hanging large psychedelic portraits of Castro, Che, Ho Chi Minh, Mao, Malcolm X, and Eldridge Cleaver. One wall was lined with posters of the fallen Fred Hampton. Above the stage, they had hung their centerpiece, a 6-foot cardboard machine gun. 400 Weathermen and friends attended, all watched closely by local police who patrolled the parking lots. The days were filled with calisthenics, karate classes, workshops, evenings with Weatherman songs written by a popular Columbia SDSer named Ted Gold, and others. He's got an example here which says, of course, I'm dreaming of a white riot, just like the one October 8th. I mean, these people. Increasingly violent speeches, frenetic dancing, and copious amounts of illegal drugs. Every speaker tried to top the one before. It's a wonderful thing to hit a pig. Rudd found himself telling the crowd, it must be a really wonderful feeling to kill a pig or blow up a building. JJ hit the high notes. We're against everything that's good and decent in honky America, he declared. We will burn and loot and destroy. We are the incubation of your mother's nightmare. But it was Dorn's speech that people would talk about for years to come. For once, she shed her cool facade and practically screamed for the crowd to avenge the murder of Fred Hampton by bringing violence and chaos, writ large or small, to white America. She told a story of an airline flight where, she claimed, she and JJ had run down the aisles stealing from the other passengers' trays. That's what we're about, she shouted. Being crazy motherfuckers and scaring the shit out of honky America. She climaxed by heaping praise on the wild-eyed Charles Manson for his cult's murders, including that of Sharon Tate and Tate's unborn baby. "Dig it," she famously cried. "First they killed those pigs, then they ate dinner in the same room with them. They even shoved a fork into the victim's stomach. Wild." Soon everyone in the hall was raising their hands in four-finger salutes, signifying the fork shoved into the pregnant Sharon Tate's belly. Most nights, many of the delegates repaired to the nave of a nearby Catholic church for marathon bouts of group sex. Between all the orgies and the speeches and the karate classes, there was endless speculation about what the leadership was planning. No one was entirely sure what they would be asked to do, although it was assumed that bombings would be a part of it. But what else? In one gathering, they debated whether killing a white baby was a properly revolutionary act. Behind closed doors, meanwhile, the leadership was in fact finalizing a battle plan, discussing the whats and hows and whens of a struggle that until that point had been purely hypothetical. On New Year's Day 1970, as the last of the attendees rubbed their eyes at the dawn of a new decade, only one thing seemed certain: the Weathermen were going to war. I mean, like, you're absolutely correct there, he is. I mean, these people are just completely anti-white in every single way. And when you see statements made on leftist Twitter saying no more white babies in various forms of their propaganda, one way or another, they're serious. They are indeed serious when they say these things, and they are absolutely serious in every conceivable way. This is what they want. Although it's interesting, though, because I am aware a little bit of the Sharon Tate murder, or I should say murders, because there were multiple people murdered in that incident, which the Sharon Tate murders are interesting because, as I'm aware and as I understand, Sharon Tate is actually her husband wasn't actually a white man; he was a Jew. So it's very fascinating that they're classifying her. I mean, obviously Sharon was white. Her husband and her child, her husband was Jewish, a Hollywood Jew producer, I think, if I remember correctly. I can't remember his name. And her child would have been a Mischling, just like Bernadine herself. So it's very interesting that she has this attitude, or if she's just simply unaware. And you get the feeling that some of this is just simply stochastic in its nature. And when somebody like a Curtis Yarvin type mentions how, oh, this is all just emergent behavior, this is kind of where you might be sympathetic with that viewpoint, because this is obviously not planned. And if she had known that is the case, the Manson murders might have looked differently. The point being is that all of this action, regardless of the Tate murders or any of the actions of the Weathermen, the point is they're not satisfied with how fast the revolution is going, and they're dissatisfied with how far it's going. And as we mentioned many, many times before, and as I mentioned in the previous chapter, the purpose of the revolution is to get liberals disciplined to go further and faster, and it is to complete the cycle of revolution and to make sure that the revolution advances as far and as fast as it can conceivably go. Other sources, of course, mention basically the same thing. The revolution doesn't actually properly begin until after the reforms have been implemented. All of this stuff happens after the civil rights legislation gets implemented. All of it happens after that, right? So they really can't say why they're still upset because even in the case of that incident with the particular Black Panther, Fred Hampton, um, these people are still incredibly violent and notoriously violent, and they're getting even more violent, and then they get upset that the cops are oppressing them. So it's just completely ridiculous. Yeah, and of course, this is why I wanted to cover this book, is because it's absolutely shocking. It's absolutely exhilarating and depressing, and there are very discomforting patterns if you get through the entirety of the text. It's a very long book, and that's why I wanted to cover it, because it is incredible. And it's funny because like they kind of share like our opinions on some things. Um, yeah, it absolutely is exhilarating and depressing. It's funny because you tend to discount horseshoe theory, but the patterns of behavior of any sort of like radical or revolutionary movement don't really change all that much. They're very, very similar. And so it's like a partial validation of horseshoe theory, but it's more like these people are behaving this way because of the necessity of revolution, essentially. And that's just what it is. That's just what it does. Once the revolution's over, they kind of go back to being normal. Um, I mean, what else is there to say on this chapter? I mean, you can kind of just leave it at that. I mean, it speaks for itself, really. Um, and realistically, you can begin to see the modern left, this new left forming. Right. This chapter is very important for that, because you've already established the dissatisfaction of Black radicals post civil rights. This is telling you that the white radicals are basically bang on the money, and they understand incredibly intuitively that the strategy of the coalition of the margins has to include the Black population, and there's a reason for that. And I think the reason for that is because progressives being the real racists and all, that population group will always be disenfranchised, shall we say, will always feel that way in an America that is majority white. Um, and they're always going to be dissatisfied. So, once the promises of revolution are not immediately apparent, of course they're going to get involved in violence and that stuff, because it's not going to happen, as with everything else. Um, yeah, I'm just not sure that any sort of political change is accomplishable without force at this point. It does seem like, unfortunately, history seems to play that out. I think that's an unfortunate reality of life, to be honest. Well, I think I'll leave that there for today. This is an incredibly depressing chapter, and it's one that I wanted to get into because, as I said, you can see that the coalition of the Frenches is forming. They've pushed out all of the radical labor groups. Basically, they pushed out the Maoists and the classical Leninists now, and they're moving into violence, basically. So the next turn of the chapter is chapter 4, and that one is between January and March 1970. And I'll just leave everybody with the title of that as a teaser, and it's called "As to Killing People, We Were Prepared to Do That." So stay tuned. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, everyone. I will leave it at that and log off now.